Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to the Embrace Mental Health podcast,
where we embrace a not-so-clinical approach
to conversations surrounding all things mental health. Happy Mental Health Monday, everybody, and welcome to episode two, my hand didn't get in there, of the Embrace podcast. Today we are talking just kind of general mental health, kind of what it is, what it looks like, what it means, and yeah, just kind of laying the base work for all the rest of the stuff that we're going to talk about on this podcast. So another thing that we're going to start doing in our podcast is we're going to start and end each episode with a question. The first question is for us. Right now we're going to come up with those, but later on we might have enough people that have questions for us. And then the end of the episode, we'll have kind of a self-reflective question of something just to think about and to kind of take away and chew from each episode. So Wes, do you want to go ahead and start us off with our question for this week?
Yes, but first let me just say you put that so beautifully, because once we start getting listener questions, it's really going to be a conversation, right? They're going to be asking us questions, we'll respond, and then it's like, now we will ask you a question or give you something to take home with you, and then maybe you'll write back to us or talk to us in some way, and then we'll address it in the next episode. So that's beautiful. But my first question that I brought is for my co-hosts here. How are you right now in this moment?
All right, so I'll go first. My name is Kelsey, and right now I would say I'm a little bit cold, I'm a little bit hungry, and I'm very excited. I've just really been enjoying kind of doing these episodes with Wes and Autumn, and I'm just excited to get to talk with them.
Yeah, my name's Autumn. I am feeling pretty anxious right now, very unrelated to the podcast. It's just kind of how I exist in life these days, but also really excited. I just feel like this podcast is going to be so clutch, and I'm happy to be a part of it. So, and I'm also pretty full because I just ate my weight in Skinny Pop and it was really good. So yeah.
How much Skinny Pop do you need to eat before it's no longer Skinny Pop? That's the question.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's like those the lean cuisine. It's like, if that's all you eat, how's that going to go? Anyway, it's all marketing. So I am also a little hungry, and we're recording this at about 5 p.m. and I'm on a somewhat strict eating and sleeping schedule, which I'm happy about, except in moments like these, but that's okay. And I am noticing the tension in my body that denotes stress. And here's a little mental health nugget. Stress isn't always bad, right? There's eustress and there's distress. And eustress gives us focus and energy to do the things we need to do. And that's what I'm experiencing right now. Distress makes it hard to do what we need to do. And that's not so much there. I'm thinking about my family back home and how they're excited to have me back home after we're done recording this. So that's maybe my little bit of distress. And that's the highlights of how I'm doing right now. So, and I guess I better say I'm excited too. I am excited. That's part of the stress. It's part of, I can't really stop smiling because I just like, okay, we're doing this and it's going well and I'm so excited.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right. So this week's episode, we're just kind of touching on a little bit of all things mental health. Like I said, kind of laying a little bit of basics. So the first thing, we kind of wanted to cover just a few statistics. So I will put all of the citations for these statistics in show notes, but just a few things. 1 in 5 people will experience mental illness each year. In the United States, almost half of adults, so 46.4%, will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. So almost half of people will go through a mental health issue at some point. Of like kind of statistically breaking that down into different categories, 33.7% of Americans will have an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. And some people believe that's more likely to be closer to 50%. And about 15% estimated experience depression at some point in their lifetime. There's a lot of coexisting with those two things. They're not often separate. They often are not friends. Like, I don't know, friends doesn't seem like the right word for that. But
maybe they're on a, like you said, they're on a spectrum or a continuum. Yeah. And yet, yeah, they can go hand in hand as well.
Yep. So of people who are diagnosed with depression, 50% of those people are also diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And when you generally think of kind of just an age category, young adults ages 18 to 25 have the highest rate of experiencing mental health concerns. So
maybe you listening to this right now are shaking your head and be like, yep, that tracks.
It me.
Yeah. Yes, it me.
Yeah, I think something important to note that we talked about before we started recording, all of these numbers are based off of self-reporting. And so it is very likely that they are very underrepresentative of the actual, what I call mental health crisis that is very prevalent in our country and in our world.
Yeah. Yeah, this is obviously not from a statistical research study, but I mean, it wouldn't surprise me as somebody who works in this field if the actual numbers of people who would be diagnosable for these things are closer to double that than the actual numbers that are listed.
Yeah.
I don't want to, throw out false facts or fake news, but that's my opinion anyway.
Yeah, definitely agree.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we thought it would be important to kind of talk about would be, what is mental illness? It's a very nebulous question in a lot of ways. But yeah, I don't know. What do you guys have?
Well, in preparation for this episode, we were discussing this just in general so that we wouldn't be caught totally unawares by this question of what is mental illness. And I said that I'm not going to go on a tirade, but I'm actually going to try to condense my tirade into something that is not a tirade. Okay, so as we mentioned in the introduction episode, I have a master's in counseling, and I have a private practice, and I'm familiar with mental illness from a clinical perspective, and I diagnose people from time to time with mental illnesses. And so from my perspective is actually a little bit uncommon in the mental health fields. So without getting into it too much in the deep weeds, mental health in general is, in my opinion, pretty over medicalized. There's this whole system where most people who are therapists or practice mental health get reimbursed by insurance companies, and the insurance companies demand that there is a diagnosis. They demand that certain evidence-based treatments are put into effect for them to be able to pay for that treatment. And so, really in our society, if people can't get paid, we can't do this for a living, right? And so our field kind of conforms to that whole reality. And I actually don't take insurance at my private practice. And that's part of it, is that it's kind of against my philosophy of what is mental health. I don't really want it to be run by insurance companies' preferences. And certainly nothing against those who take insurance. There's pros and cons to any kind of approach. But anyway, so there's that reality. And there's this thing that mental health professionals use when they diagnose a mental illness called the DSM. The current edition is the 5TR, the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual. I might have gotten those words slightly wrong, but overall that's correct. Yeah. So, and I've heard it referred to many times as the Bible of mental health, or of mental illness, perhaps. And what it is basically is it's put together by a group of psychiatrists, and they review it every year, to my understanding. And it's basically sets of symptoms that if you have these symptoms in the view of a mental health professional who is trained, then, and it has all these kinds of qualifiers. If you meet these qualifications, then you can be diagnosed with this mental illness, and an insurance company can pay for your therapy. So there's, again, pros and cons to this whole reality. But that, at least from this perspective, is what a mental illness is. It's a set of symptoms that a group of psychiatrists put into a book that we use to do therapy and get paid for it. And so that might sound a little bit cynical, I guess, or a little bit cold, because that's not how people experience mental illness in their day-to-day lives. And so I certainly want to, maybe invite Autumn or Kelsey to expand upon that. But I think that it helps to have this perspective that mental illness and even like the mind, what is the mind? Where is the mind? These are not things that are necessarily measurable under a microscope in the same ways that physical illnesses are. And yet they are very real. They are things that we experience in our day-to-day life. I think it would be really hard to argue for anybody out there that mental illness is a false, fake thing that does not exist. Clearly it exists. It affects our day-to-day lives. But when asked what is mental illness, I guess what I think about is essentially it's problems with living. It's when you encounter certain kinds of situations based on your context, based on your past, what are the ways that you respond to it that don't work for you? That's kind of how I define it, at least in my practice and in my own mind as I think about it. And again, if it's a diagnosable mental illness, a diagnosis can be very helpful, because when you get a diagnosis of anxiety or depression or bipolar or schizophrenia or whatever it is, it's like, oh, this crazy experience that I've been having that makes me feel alone in society. It's an actual thing that a lot of people deal with. And there's a whole community of people who deal with these kinds of symptoms. And so I'm so glad that I have this kind of label that can help me feel more normalized. So there's good aspects to this. Of course, there's the bad aspects too, where sometimes it's like, you know what, if we didn't look at this as an illness that needs to be treated, that needs to go away, we might find that this is just kind of a part of who you are as a person that is manifesting in a way that isn't working for you. And we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sometimes this part of you that is diagnosed as a mental illness, maybe it's trying to tell you something that's going to be helpful for you, or maybe you can tweak it in ways that actually work to your advantage. Maybe the thing that makes life hard could actually give you advantages in your day-to-day life. So that's my tirade. And believe it or not, that is the edited down version of it. But I hope that is a little bit of a helpful framework as we're discussing this, that it really is hard, because it's not like, in black and white, here's what it is. And even within, among mental health professionals, a lot of people would listen to what I had to say and be like, ooh, that's a little bit on the edge or something like that. Sounds like he's saying that it's not a real thing. I certainly hope it didn't come across that way, but it's not the same as physical illness. And what I do as a therapist is not the same thing as what a doctor does. So I will be quiet for a while.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to try and define something that isn't like super easily measurable. Because obviously, like, if you were to say, what is strep throat? You would say it is this virus that we can detect on this test,
Exactly.
Kind of thing. Whereas like mental health is, anxiety can look different for me than it looks for somebody else. And sometimes there are some things that are in common. Like there are, like you said, in the DSM, there are like this list of symptoms. And if you have 5 out of the 8 of these or whatever it is, then you probably have anxiety, whatever it is.
For at least 6 months.
Right.
All those qualifiers, yeah.
But it's a lot harder to define, because it's objective in some ways of how you measure it or how you experience it. And objective does not mean it's not real or that it's made up, but...
Or subjective, yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yep, subjective.
Yeah.
But yes. I think too, I think generally in society, there's been a little bit of a growth in understanding. But I feel like when I was in college, so like 10 years ago or so, for a long time, like at least what I kind of had initially understood mental illness to be was like, it was always associated with like the Columbine shooters or Charles Manson or insert Netflix documentary subject here, like kind of a thing.
dangerous, crazy
But
people,
yes,
basically.
dangerous, crazy people. And so like it was almost like, oh, I'm not going to say that I struggle with mental illness because then people are going to think I'm a psycho, like, you know, kind of thing. But recognizing that like that has its own piece of understanding, but like you said, mental illness can just be when your thought patterns or your headspace or whatever it is, however you define it or experience it, like you said, is not working well for you or is causing you to experience negative consequences or symptoms. And that, like, symptoms feels a little bit like a clinical kind of a word to it too, but you know, just understanding, I don't know, what it is, what it isn't. And mental illness is much more than, yeah, being crazy. It's not that.
Let me give a brief example that I think that most of our listeners can connect with. And this is a political example, so get ready for another spicy take here.
Buckle
But
in, here we go.
no, but and so I'm not
sending
going
all
to
these emails to you, Wes. No, I'm just
go
kidding.
for it. I'm not giving my personal perspective here. I'm going to tell you my experience in grad school. When I was in grad school, Donald Trump was the president. And there were people who were in my program who would posit that Donald Trump had what is called narcissistic personality disorder. And if you look at the symptoms in the DSM, he probably actually does meet most of them. I think even his fans would probably say, like, oh, if you look at that, well, yeah, sure, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, you know, and they'd probably talk about why it's a good thing. And in fact, if I remember correctly, in my diagnostic class where we learned all about this exact topic, the professor talked about how Trump would not be diagnosed with a mental illness, with this specific mental illness, even if he meets the symptoms, because it's working for him, right? If it's not causing problems in your daily life, a mental health professional should not be diagnosing you with that mental illness. And yet, you might meet all the symptoms. So that's again, it's just it's not cut and dry, black and white. I think it comes down to this problem or this issue of is it causing problems for you? What do those problems look like? How is it affecting your day-to-day life in a negative way? And that's where it would probably qualify as a mental illness instead of just kind of part of your personality.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, so we're talking a lot about like subjective and objective things, and I'm wondering if there is still though some sort of like baseline, like objective, this is not working for you, even if you feel like it's working for you. So if we're gonna run with the Trump example, unfortunately, yes, it's working for him, but it's still causing problems. It's still not, and I don't even mean causing problems in like the super political way, right? Yeah. It's in my brain, at least, I guess is a good way to put this. In my brain, objectively, something is wrong here. And so I guess because mental illness can be so, or mental health and the way that we experience it can be so subjective, I do wonder though if there is like the necessity for something like the DSM to state like whether or not you want to accept it or whether or not you feel like it's giving you all of the advantages and it's working for you, you do have a mental illness. It's just a thought, you know, I don't know.
No,
I think
that's a great
too,
question.
it's not even so much, is it working for you? Like that is a question to ask, but I think also it's like, is it working for your family? Is it working for your friends? Is it working for the people around you? Like you might think it's working to your advantage, but you could also be hurting some people if you're not
Right.
honest about, you know, some of the things that you might be experiencing. But yeah, it's a complicated thing to define. But like
And
you said,
if we play this out, if it's causing problems for the people around you, for your family, for your coworkers, for your you know, the people who are maybe under you in some context, that's going to have consequences for you, right? So I think that that's the thing, is where I would go with that is like, it is subjective, but eventually, you know, our actions have consequences, and our actions come out of our thoughts and our feelings and our beliefs and how we respond to those things. And so if you are making everyone in your family hate you, if you are making it hard for the people around you to do their work effectively in some way, well, that might not be affecting you at first, but eventually it's kind of going to come back to bite you. And you might find yourself in some kind of a mental health scenario with a therapist or whatever else that looks like for you in a support group. Maybe it's a substance addiction of some kind or whatever. And it's like, okay, I didn't think this was causing me a problem until all these other things in my life started falling apart because of the ways that it was affecting the people around me. Their problem is my problem. We're all connected.
Yeah.
So then I have another question, or like part of the conversation. So then would we, if I'm a person and I have these traits and I'm functioning what I believe is well with them, and then, years down the line or whatever, it starts to impact the people around me negatively, does it become a mental illness once it starts impacting people negatively, or has it always been a mental illness and it just wasn't diagnosed? Again, I know like none of us are experts or anything. We're talking about this very nebulous thing. I'm just like conversation.
No, but I think these are important questions because we're asking what is mental illness, and this is a mental
Right.
health podcast, and so we better be able to give some kind of an answer for it, right?
Yeah.
But I guess if I could respond to that, it would be according to whom? Who are you asking here? The person diagnosing? Well, then that's up to their professional judgment. Are you asking the person who is kind of at the center of this story? Well, then the question becomes, is this a problem for them? Is this something that they experience as a problem, whether it's having a negative impact in their daily life, or if they see how it's hurting the people around them and they're like, yeah, this actually is a problem. Like I'm fine, but I don't want to hurt these people who I love. And again, then you come back to, well, that actually is a problem for them then, because it's kind of something is dysregulated within them that makes them not okay with their own actions. Are you asking the family? Are you asking society? Are you asking the group of psychiatrists who put together the DSM? There are people who are institutionalized who have a lot of rights taken away from them because a group of professionals says, because of this evidence, because they meet these criteria, we are going to put them in this setting where they have a major loss of autonomy and control. And so in that situation, the person who is most affected by this has no say in it at all, because the way that they're affecting society, it's like, this is a dangerous person. This is a person who could potentially harm somebody. And so there are people in our society who have the right and the responsibility to imprison them, not in the prison system, but you're taking away their right to go about their life in all the ways that they want to. A lot to process because it's a big question. And
Yeah.
and I think that if I could just say one more thing about, because we're talking about subjectivity and objectivity.
Yeah.
And I was mentioning before the show, as we were getting ready to talk about this, how one of my biggest takeaways from my mental health training was that, at least from a therapist perspective, the subjective actually is probably more significant in our day-to-day life than the objective. And so we live in a society that is very scientific. We like things that are cut and dry and easy to digest. But oftentimes these kinds of discussions are a lot more gray and a lot more, well, it depends on how you look at it. And so I think that we need to actually give a lot of legitimacy to, do you experience this as a problem? Does this feel off to you? Because if it does, it's worth addressing. And we don't have to make it cut and dry. We don't have to put it under a microscope or measure it to be able to say that it's a problem. If you're experiencing it as a problem, I don't know. I've heard the same kinds of conversation come up when we're talking about areas of racism or other kinds of oppression. I can't say to somebody else, to either of you, about a gender equality issue or a sexism issue. It's like, well, actually, if you look at it this way, which is the way that most professionals agree on, this actually isn't a problem. This thing that you say is a problem for you, this way you're being discriminated against, you're actually not. So there we go. You know what I mean? It's like, it is a subjective thing. If you are experiencing it as a problem, that's a pretty good reason to see it as a problem.
All right. Shall we move on to our next definition. Since we so well defined this last one. So next question that we have up is, what is mental health?
I was hoping the definition of mental illness would help inform what I think the definition of mental health is. But it didn't happen, which is okay, which is totally okay, because I think it's important to recognize that we're going to be sitting in the gray a lot in this podcast, and I think that's really healthy. And so coming up with definitions is this is going to be a challenge.
When I think of health, I think of functioning, which I don't know if that's really even helpful. It's like, okay, well, then how do you define functioning? But again, this question of, is it working? I guess I hate to come back to that because it sounds so arbitrary and vague, but are you experiencing it as a problem, or are you experiencing it as working well? If I take, I guess I consider myself a pretty mentally healthy person, not 100% of the time in every situation, but in comparison to most people I encounter, I guess, if we're going to use the comparison metric, I consider myself pretty mentally healthy most of the time. And it depends, if you asked me this question 6 months ago, I might not have said that. But, and so I guess how I experience that in my own life subjectively is that I'm able to respond to challenges and to whatever life is throwing at me. And don't get me wrong, life is throwing plenty of stressors and challenges at me, but the ways that I'm thinking about those and responding to those and being affected by those emotionally are not adding to the feeling of danger and the weight of those things on me. I'm responding them in ways that I experience as being pretty effective. I came across the definition, and I wish that I could find exactly who said it. It was some author and mental health professional, that narrows it down. But she was talking about how mental health, sometimes we think about mental health like we are in control of our emotions and we only express emotions in the ways that we want to when we want to. And just how unrealistic and inaccurate that is. And about how it has to do with how we are responding and adapting to what life is throwing at us. So if a dear loved one of mine dies, I'm going to be overcome by grief, and I'm going to cry a lot, and I'm going to fall apart and feel overwhelmed, but that's what's appropriate to that situation. Do I have a mental illness there? No, I'm grieving. I'm being human, right? So I think that that's one pretty clear example of how, like you two are, I've heard from both of you so far in this podcast that what is true of one person, you might look at the same thing, apply it to another person, and it's considered mentally unhealthy.
I think too, one thing that I kind of think about is in terms of even what is mental illness. A lot of times I think so much of what stems, becomes mental illness kind of a thing can be a learned response to trauma or, an injury or whatever word you want to put on it, because, sometimes trauma has these connotations on it. And that's, I've had to relearn what that word means and come to terms with oh, I did experience trauma as a child. I had always thought, well, traumatic childhoods are only for people with terrible parents or, whatever it is here. But so much of my mental illness was this response to this injury that I had experienced, kind of a thing. And so when I think of mental health in so many ways, a pursuit of mental health is a pursuit of healing, a healing of injuries or trauma or whatever word you want to put onto it, something that hurt you and that now you have a different learned response than what you want to, or your mind says, I've been here before, it went terrible, so I need to panic now because that's how it's going to go every time, kind of a thing, versus that happened. My response at that time was appropriate, but how do I pursue healing so that the next time something comes up, I don't immediately go into that hole. I have a different level of strength, a different level of health to me now that I can rely on because I pursued healing of a past injury, I guess, kind of a thing to it.
So well said. I am cheering on the inside here. In my private practice, I specialize in grief and trauma, and I totally have that trauma perspective that so much of what we call mental illness or being unhealthy mentally You described it so well. I have very little to add to that. I guess just that it, to rephrase that, it's like something that happened to me when I was 9 that didn't even necessarily look traumatic to the people around me, that stuck with me, and it makes me stress out and respond in an unhealthy way that doesn't work for me in my day-to-day life now in my 30s. Pretty wild.
Right.
And I think that's true for, I would argue, the majority of what we consider mental illness has some connection to a traumatic experience. That's huge.
Mhm.
I have nothing to add. You guys blew it out the water.
All right. So then our last question for this episode, why does mental health matter? Why does this podcast matter? Why is what we're doing even worth talking about or pursuing?
Great question. Autumn, you have a response to that?
I do. I'm looking up a statistic right now. I think that having these types of conversations surrounding mental health is so important. Actually, I don't even need the statistic, just in general. Because the statistics that were mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, like this is not small. This is not a few people. This is you. This is your next door neighbor. This is your teacher, your professor. This is, the person that, I don't know, shovels your snow, right? Like, this is such a large issue. I don't know if issue is the right word, but it's such a large thing that influences so many people's lives. It influences the way that people navigate the world, how people see the world around them, how people navigate relationships. And there are two, I'm sure there's more than two, but like the two that I'm going to like mention, there's the beauty of healing, right? That often won't happen if we don't have conversations like this, and conversations that we'll continue to have throughout this podcast. Conversations like this make room for healing and empower people to pursue healing. And the other side of the same coin, like without conversations like this, people suffer, right? People don't know. People don't know what to do. People don't know what's going on with them. And what I was looking up was the like suicide rates in our country. I saw the number and it's too sad. I don't want to talk about it right now. But very genuinely, like, it's so high. So many people end up taking their own lives because of poor mental health. And so having conversations like this is so important, because we want to take what is often like stuffed down in the dark. We take our mental illness and we want to like keep it to ourselves, or we take our mental health struggles and we just like, we don't want to talk about it. Sometimes it feels shameful, or you feel silly for like reacting the way that you do in a situation. Cause like we were talking about with trauma, it's just the way your nervous system responded and you don't really know what to do about it. It feels silly. We want to take it and we want to like keep it to ourselves. And I think like just like ripping the blinds open and like putting light on this and like pulling it apart, like investigating it, talking about it, like processing through it is so important, because it empowers people to move from this place of despair and slowly work towards this place of healing, whatever that looks like for them.
And living fully.
Yeah.
I think that's what so much of it comes down to, is like, I want to live my life to the fullest. I want that for the people around me. I want to be a positive character in their story, not a negative character in their story. I think, again, these are shared human desires and drives. Yeah. That's why this affects everybody, and this is what it looks like. We have control over our thoughts to a large degree, or at least which thoughts we focus on and how we respond to them. And that is great news, because I think that so often we just go through life on autopilot and we look around and we ask, how did we get here? And understanding that we can change and learn and grow and heal and look at things from a new perspective in ways that actually change our interactions and how we respond to stress and our choices, big and small, that really add up to our whole lives, right? So that's really what we're talking about. So having an understanding of what does mental illness look like for me? What does mental health look like for me? Is it a diagnosis? Is this working for me? These are important questions to ask.
Yeah, I would, and something that I would just like kind of edit or add on to what you were saying, Wes. I think the idea of like we can control our thoughts, or we have control over our thoughts. I think that for some people that may be the case. I think something that I would be more inclined to say is we have the power to gain control over our thoughts,
There's the
right? Like
potential.
right now, yeah, the potential's there. Right now, it might not be there.
Oh, yeah.
But there are things that can be done to kind of like help you grow in that skill, that mental muscle.
Kind of
So
train it. Yeah, that's totally
yeah,
true. And yeah, I also come from a big mindfulness perspective too. So I, of course, no matter how mentally healthy you are or whatever, all kinds of crazy, weird thoughts are going to enter your mind. That's not what I'm talking about. And
yeah,
I guess I would really highlight, how do we respond to our thoughts? What thoughts do we focus
yeah,
on? How are we defined by our thoughts or not defined by our thoughts? That's a lot more realistic. Yeah, well, it's an important point.
I think, it's funny if you think of like almost an American or like Western civilization, like to be honest, like for some people, maybe this will be something that'll be like, oh, I've never thought of this before, and maybe I should care a little bit more about mental health. But like there's a certain level of where mentally unhealthy people versus mentally healthy people, or, whatever that looks like, like there's a certain level of productivity that's lost when you're not
Yeah.
mentally healthy. And not that, I mean, that's not one of the top priorities to me, but like there's a reality of which we are a better society if we have mentally healthy people. And, whether that looks like productivity or whether that just looks, some of that piece, I think, is an interesting concept that's not normally thought of.
yeah,
But I really, to go back to something Autumn said, like to me, why it matters so much is to alleviate suffering. Like you said, like there's so many people who are suffering from this. We talk about the statistics. It's not a rare problem. It's a pretty almost it is like that close. And if we're actually measuring it correctly, although we've talked about how measuring this is impossible, but of like we're probably more people than not
yeah,
are going to experience this kind of suffering at some point. And so to have tools and resources and understanding to help alleviate that suffering. I talked about in my story and sharing my story that my best friend understanding mental health at a level that she did was life-saving for me. And so understanding mental health, talking about it, having these conversations, kind of looking through that, it can be life-saving, whether it's life-saving for you, whether it's life-saving for your teacher, your professor, your best friend, your daughter, whoever it is. But on top of that, like not just life-saving, but the more that we can understand healing in that pursuit, it's life-giving as well, And so those things to me, anything that is life-saving and anything that is life-giving is worth looking into, is worth understanding and pursuing.
amen.
So, I think that something you said reminded me also how I said I often see myself as a mentally healthy person, at least in this season of life, and how I think that it is helpful. I think Kelsey mentioned earlier about depression and anxiety being kind of on a spectrum, and I find it helpful to think of really everything being on a spectrum sometimes, or at least taking that perspective that even if, this hypothetical unicorn of a person who would go through life and experience no mental illness, would never be diagnosed with nothing, that it's on a spectrum. And so there's always room to grow and to learn. And we are encountering these things in our day-to-day lives, even if we go through, even if we never see a therapist, even if we never would say that we have a mental illness. These issues really do, as we said in the introduction episode, they really do affect everyone. And there's something applicable here, I think, for everybody in this podcast and in these kinds of discussions.
Yeah. All right. Anybody with any final thoughts before we wrap up this like completely well-defined answer to all of our questions so far?
Great conversation. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think what you said is kind of the point, is that like you can really only have discussions about this. We're not going to come to a totally, settled certain conclusion about these kinds of questions. That's the way that life is, and that's the way certainly that this topic is, and I think that that's okay. I think living with that tension and discussions are more helpful and more important than definitions when it comes to these kinds of topics. So that's okay.
Beautiful. Mic drop.
Yeah.
I'm not going to drop this. It costs too much, but yeah. All right. So Wes, do you want to give us or end us up with our self-reflection question for our audience?
Yeah, reflection question. So here it is. And I think this really speaks to our conversation today. Try to take a look at your life, your life today, as you go about your life today, and try to notice your thoughts and your patterns of thoughts. And so maybe you go through your day and you think something to the effect of like, oh, there, I screwed it up again, right? And if you notice that this kind of a thought happens on a regular basis, or if it even happens more often than you're comfortable with, think about those patterns of thoughts and how is this adding to or subtracting from your mental health? It might be a thought of like, wow, what a beautiful world. Maybe that's a thought that you find yourself thinking over and over again. And is that a helpful or a hurtful thought for you listening to this podcast? Because the thought might be helpful to one person, harmful to another one. So that's it. To summarize, notice patterns of thinking. Ask yourself, is this contributing to or taking away from my mental health? All right.
Sweet.
Great question.
Thanks.
Yeah. And remember to follow us on Instagram at embrace.mental.health. And you can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/embracementalhealthnsc.
All right.
Sweet. Thanks,
Good deal.
everybody.
Talk to you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Yep.